In 2015, an unusual incident happened on the construction site for a sewage lift station in British Columbia, Canada. WorkSafe BC, the provincial health and safety agency, posted a summary of the event on YouTube. A steel caisson had been installed to hold back soil while the lift station could be constructed. One worker on the site was suddenly pulled into a sinkhole when the bottom of the caisson blew out. The cause of the incident was related to groundwater within the soils below the site. We don't all have to live in fear of the ground opening up below our feet, but engineers who design subsurface structures do have to consider the impact that groundwater can have. The solutions to subsurface problems are almost always hidden from public view, so you might never even know they're there. This video is intended to shed some light on those invisible solutions, including what could have been done to prevent that incident in BC. I'm Grady, and this is Practical Engineering. In today's episode, we're talking about how groundwater affects structures. This video is sponsored by HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. More on that later. Groundwater has always been a little mysterious to humanity since it can't easily be observed. It also behaves much differently than surface waters like rivers and oceans, sometimes defying expectations, as I've shown in a few of my previous videos. One of the most important places where groundwater shows up in civil engineering is at a dam. That's because groundwater flows from high pressure to low pressure, and a dam, at its simplest, is just a structure that divides those two conditions. And what do you know, I've got an acrylic box in my garage full of sand to show these concepts in real life. You can imagine this soil sits below the base of a dam, and I can adjust the water levels on either side of the structure to simulate how groundwater will flow. Blue dye placed in the sand helps show the direction and speed of water movement below the surface. A higher level on the upstream side creates pressure, driving water in the subsurface below the dam to the opposite end of the model. I'll be the first to say it, this is not the most mind-blowing revelation. You probably could have predicted it without the fancy model, but to a civil engineer, this is not an inconsequential phenomenon, and for a couple of reasons. First, water seeping below a dam can erode soil particles away, a phenomenon called piping. Obviously, you don't want part of your structure's foundation to be stolen from underneath it, and piping can create a positive feedback loop where failure progresses rapidly. I have a whole video on piping that you can check out after this one. The second negative effect of groundwater is less obvious. In fact, until around the 1920s, dam engineers didn't even take it into account, leading to the demise of many early structures in history. The engineering of a dam is largely an exercise in resisting hydrostatic pressure. Water in the reservoir applies an enormous force to the upstream face of a dam, and if not designed properly, that force can cause the dam to slide downstream or overturn. The hydrostatic force is actually pretty simple to approximate. Pressure in a fluid increases with depth, so you get a triangular distributed load. Once you know that load, you can design a structure to resist it. And there are a lot of ways to do that. One of the most common types of dam just uses its own weight for stability. Gravity dams are designed to be heavy enough that hydrostatic forces can't slide them backwards or turn them over. But to the dismay of those early engineers, pressure from the reservoir is not the only destabilizing force on a dam. Take a look at this pipe I've included in the model that shows the water level between the two boundaries. If the base of a structure was below the water level shown here, the groundwater would be applying pressure to the bottom, counteracting its weight. We call this uplift pressure. Remember that the only reason gravity dams stay put is because of their weight. So you can see how having an unanticipated force effectively subtracting some of that weight would be a bad thing. Many concrete gravity.
That's actually a pretty interesting concept that they had there. I certainly didn't realize that previously. I think it makes sense as you think about it, but I haven't put much thought into groundwater previously. Again, being from a software engineering background, so I often don't think about the physical world all that often and the implications of those things. And that's one of the reasons why I find this area particularly interesting is that it allows me to see various aspects of engineering that I normally take for granted, especially in our everyday world and things that are around us. But that's a very interesting concept that they highlighted of if water kind of gets in underneath the structure, it also lifts it up a bit, which I hadn't realized. And that's a very interesting problem to have to account for, considering, as you can imagine, most structures, you don't have control of everything surrounding that structure. And I know nowadays especially with like global warming and things, you're probably seeing a lot more floods and extreme weather in areas. And to think that like an aspect of how you have to build a structure includes water potentially coming up from underneath the structure as well, and you have no control realistically on whether that water will get there or not, is a very interesting problem to have to solve.
Dams have failed because this uplift force was neglected by engineers, including the St. Francis Dam in California that killed more than 400 people when it collapsed in 1928. Many consider this to be the worst American civil engineering disaster of the 20th century. Unlike the hydrostatic force of a reservoir, uplift pressure from groundwater is a much more complicated force to characterize. It exists in the interface between the structure and its foundation, in the cracks and pores of the underlying soil, and even within the joints of the concrete structure itself. The flow of groundwater is affected by soil properties, the geometry of the dam, the water levels upstream and downstream, and even the subsurface features. How these factors affect the uplift pressure can be pretty challenging to predict, but engineers do have to predict it. After all, we can't build a dam, measure the actual uplift force, and add weight if necessary. It's got to work the first time. One way to characterize groundwater flow around structures is the flow net. This is a graphical tool used by engineers to estimate the volume and pressure of seepage in the subsurface. In simple terms, you divide the flow area into a curvilinear grid, where one axis represents pressure and the other represents flow. If this looks familiar, you might notice that a flow net is essentially a 2D solution to the Laplace equation, which also applies to other areas of physics including heat flow and magnetic fields. Developing flow nets is almost an art as much as a science, so it's probably a good thing that groundwater problems are mostly solved using software these days. But we can still use flow nets to demonstrate a few of the ways engineers combat this nefarious uplift force on gravity dams. And one common idea is a cutoff wall. If water flowing below a dam causes so many problems, why not just create a vertical wall to cut it off? We do it all the time. But how deep does it need to be? Some dams might have a convenient geological layer into which a cutoff can be terminated, creating an impenetrable envelope to keep seepage out.
It's an interesting idea. So basically, they just said, basically build a big wall to block it. One of my initial thoughts here would have been kind of have like a make like an artificial river, I guess, for lack of a better term, kind of like have some outlet for the water to go alongside the dam. Because again, if you're just looking for groundwater, then this isn't necessarily water from the dam itself, but also presumably you could also use it as like a spillover mechanism. And so I would have expected like maybe you could have built some like trenches that go alongside the outside of the dam beyond its like not right up against the structure, and then that could at least sort of force water away from the structure that you have. Building a very tall wall seems to be an interesting challenge in so much as like you are seems to be a similar problem to the dam itself, which is like you'd have to make it so big and so heavy that you're assuming certain characteristics for it in order for it to actually do the job that it has. And again, you might have to do that without the knowledge of what's actually there.
But many don't. Cutoff walls can still reduce the volume of flow and the pressure, even if seepage can still make its way underneath. Let's take a look at the model to see why. I've added a vertical wall of acrylic below the upstream face of my dam, and we'll see how it affects the flow. The groundwater flow lines adjust to go under the wall and back up to the other side of the model. If you look closely, you'll see a slight decrease in the uplift measurement pipe below the dam. The only thing I changed between this model and the last one was adding the cutoff wall. So why would the pressure decrease on the downstream side? The flow of groundwater is described with a fairly simple formula known as Darcy's law. Besides the permeability of the soil, the only other factor controlling the speed water flows is the hydraulic gradient, which consists of the difference in pressure over the length of a flow path. By adding a cutoff wall, I didn't change the difference in pressure between one side of the model and the other, but I did increase the length of the flow path water had to take below the dam, reducing the hydraulic gradient. I can sketch a flow net over the model to make this clearer. The black lines are equipotentials. They connect areas of equal pressure. The blue lines show the directions of flow. Without a cutoff, the flow paths are shorter and thus the equipotential lines are closer together. With a cutoff wall, the equipotential lines are spread out. That means both the volume of seepage and the uplift pressure at the base of the structure have been reduced. Cutoff walls on dams have a long history of use, and nearly all large gravity dams have at least some kind of cutoff. It can be as simple as excavating a wide area of the dam's foundation before starting on construction. And that's a popular choice because it gives engineers a chance to observe the subsurface conditions and make sure there are no faults or problems before the dam gets built. Another option is to excavate a deep trench and fill it with grout, concrete, or a slurry of impermeable clay. For smaller or temporary structures, sheet piles can be driven into the subsurface to create a cutoff. One final option is to inject high-pressure grout to create an impenetrable curtain below the dam. The other way to deal with seepage and uplift pressure are drains. Drains installed below a dam do two important jobs. First, they filter seepage using sand and gravel so that soil particles can't be piped out from the foundation. Second, they relieve uplift pressure by removing the water. Let's see how this works in my model. Upstream of my uplift monitor, I've added a hole through the back of the model with a tube to drain seepage out. Instead of flowing all the way downstream, now some of the seepage flows up to and through the drain. And you can see this in the streamlines of dye flowing in the subsurface. Again, the effect is subtle, but the uplift pressure monitor is showing a slight decrease in pressure compared to the original configuration. There's less pressure on the base of the dam than there would be without the drain. Plotting a flow net over the model, you can see why it behaves this way. The drain relieves the uplift on the base by creating an area of low pressure below the dam. You can also note that the drain actually increases the hydraulic gradient by shortening the flow paths, so there's actually more seepage happening than there would be without the drain. However, because the drains are installed with filters to reduce the chance of piping, that additional seepage is often worth the decrease in uplift pressure. Many concrete dams include a row of vertical drains into the foundation, and some even use pumps to depress the groundwater level further, minimizing the uplift. I can simulate this by lowering the downstream level as if a pump was removing the water. Watch how the flow lines adjust when I make this change in the model. Like drains, these relief wells create more seepage below a dam because of the greater difference in pressure between the two sides, but they can significantly reduce the uplift pressure and thus increase a structure's stability. I've been using dams as the main example of managing groundwater flow, but lots of other structures have similar issues. Retaining walls and temporary shoring have to contend with groundwater challenges, including caissons, which are watertight chambers sunk into the earth to hold back soil during construction. Remember the worker I mentioned in the intro? He was on a site near a caisson. It's typical to dewater a structure like this, meaning the water is pumped out, creating a dry area for construction crews to work. Let's take a look at how this works in the model. I'm simulating the act of pumping water out of the caisson by draining out of the model at the bottom of the structure. When a caisson is dewatered, it's essentially working like a dam, separating an area of high pressure from low pressure within only a short distance between them. And as you know, distance matters when it comes to groundwater because the shorter the flow paths, the greater the hydraulic gradient, and thus the higher the volume and velocity of seepage. If you look closely, you can see the sand boiling up as the seepage exits the soil into the bottom of the caisson. This elevated pressure in the subsurface and high velocity of flow means that the soil particles themselves aren't being strongly held together. All it takes is a little agitation for the soil to liquefy and flow into the bottom of the caisson, creating a sinkhole that can easily swallow anything at the surface. One way of mitigating this hazard is dewatering the soil outside the caisson. Construction crews use well points, small, evenly spaced wells and pumps to draw water out of the soil so it can't seep to areas of lower pressure. Caissons can also be driven deeper into the subsurface, creating a condition similar to a cutoff wall on a dam. They can even go deep enough to reach an impermeable layer, creating a better seal that prevents water from flowing in through the bottom. Thankfully for that worker in BC, his colleagues were able to rescue him before he was consumed by the earth. Next time you see a dam, retaining wall, caisson, or any other subsurface construction, there's a good chance that engineers have had to consider how groundwater will affect the stability.
Yeah, so it was an interesting problem. He did very quickly go over how it's very similar to a dam. Another option in my mind that seemed plausible here would be he kind of highlighted the drain option for a dam in itself. For this one, presumably, at least from what I observed, this caisson seems to be effectively like a cylinder in the ground. And so, if anything, it seems like it would also be possible to kind of introduce piping or tunnels around the caisson in order for sort of like kind of creating a artificial flow path around the caisson, because it does seem like the water is naturally going downwards in order to try to find its way around, and that's where kind of getting to like bedrock or whatever that was that he was referencing to kind of use it as a seal prevents this, because then there's no path for the water to go through. And so it seems like if you had an outlet for the water to get around the caisson, then you would also be able to avoid this problem, which he didn't highlight. He mostly just referenced that wall. He might cover that soon or other alternatives.
Even though you'd never know they're there, some combination of drains and cutoffs were probably installed to keep the structure and the people around it safe and sound. Speaking of sounds, here's the peaceful sound of a napping toddler while my wife and I prepare a home-cooked meal from the sponsor of this video, HelloFresh.
What do you call that?
Hot raisin water.
HelloFresh has kid-friendly recipes for picky eaters, but this one's just for us. The meals take about 30 minutes to prepare, which is perfect for nap time because it's really hard to film yourself preparing lunch while chasing a toddler at the same time.
Raisin water did not seem particularly appetizing, so I don't know if this was the best sponsor ship video for this, but I guess we'll see what else they share.
Especially when the photographer is 9 months pregnant. But our little helper just couldn't stand to be left out of the fun, so he woke up early anyway.
Yes.
HelloFresh also has different plans to meet your various nutritional or dietary goals like pescatarian, fit and wholesome, or vegetarian, which is what we usually get. It's a perfect way to make a change or try something new. And this is not just us being mean, by the way, he really loves lemons. And here's the most important thing, HelloFresh meals are delicious. We've done this for quite a while now, and there isn't a single recipe that we haven't enjoyed. Actually, we got invited to a party at the last minute, so we ended up combining the portions of this meal and bringing it to share. And it was a huge hit.
I said zigzag. Oh, that's pretty good.
Go try it yourself at HelloFresh.com, and if you use code PRACTICAL16, you'll get up to 16 free meals plus 3 surprise gifts. I wouldn't recommend it if I didn't think you would love it. That's HelloFresh.com and use my code PRACTICAL16. Thank you for watching and let me know what you think.
Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.